There is a promise most of us make without ever saying it out loud. It begins early. Before we understand language properly, before we understand consequence, it sounds like this. One day I'll get there. One day I'll become who I'm supposed to be. One day, everything will finally make sense. We carry that sentence through our entire lives. We just change the ending. When we're young, there is so far away. When we get older, there moves. It never disappears. It just relocates. And without realizing it, we begin organizing our lives around the belief that we rarely question. That fulfillment is waiting ahead of us. That peace is something we arrive at, not something we understand, not something we can possess now. And this belief is so universal it doesn't feel like a belief at all. It feels like reality. But myths have always been more honest than our assumptions. In ancient stories, desire is never neutral. It always transforms the person who carries it. King Midas believes one more gift will complete him. Icarus believes there is no real limit to what he could reach. Achilles becomes the greatest warrior in history and is still defined by what cannot be healed. These are not stories about achievement. They are stories about expectation, about what happens when wanting becomes infinite. And yet, we continue to tell ourselves the same quiet promise, that everything we're chasing is just one step away from becoming enough. Maybe that's why modern life feels like constant motion without arrival. Athletes win the highest honors and still speak about feelings of emptiness. Artists reach the highest level of recognition and then quietly step away. Entrepreneurs spend decades building something, then sell it and wonder why nothing feels different. We treat these as separate outcomes, but they all point toward the same question. What if arrival was never designed to satisfy what pursuit awakened? And if that's true, then the question is no longer how people reach their goals. It becomes, why do we believe reaching them will ever complete us? Because maybe the promise was never real. Maybe it was just the only way we could convince ourselves to begin moving. There's an incredible moment every story usually leads toward. A point where movement becomes stillness. Where becoming turns into just being. Where pursuit finally collapses into arrival. We imagine that moment as relief, as clarity, as the end of uncertainty. But in almost every myth that survives time, that moment is not an ending. It is a transformation, a brand new beginning. Because once you arrive, the world doesn't stop. It changes how it looks at you. Before success, you are becoming. After success, you are defined. And definition is far more permanent than becoming ever was. The crown is placed on the head, but it is the world that decides what it means. And from that moment forward, subtle changes begin to happen. Internally, the freedom to change begins to narrow. Not because change is impossible, but because change is no longer private. Everything becomes interpreted. Everything becomes measured. Everything becomes compared. In hip-hop, this transformation is visible in real time. Jay-Z does not release music into a vacuum. He releases it into history. Eminem does not exist in the present tense. He exists beside his own legacy. Lil Wayne is not judged as a new artist. He is measured against a version of himself that no longer exists. And slowly, the illusion from earlier begins to break apart. We were told, once I get there, I'll finally be at peace. But success does not end the question. It changes its shape. Now the question becomes, can you remain successful? Can you make another masterpiece? Can you justify your celebrity? Can you survive being underneath the microscope of fame? Because greatness does not behave like a destination. It behaves like gravity. It pulls everything back toward the moment you were first recognized. Every experiment becomes comparison. Every silence becomes meaning. Every shift becomes suspicion. And what was once a dream of freedom becomes a condition of permanence. The crown does not simply say you have arrived. It says you must remain what you have become. And in that realization, the story stops being about pursuit and turns into something far more fragile: the maintenance of identity under weight. There comes a point in every myth when the fire goes out. Not all at once, not in a blaze, but in the quiet after the feast, when the banners have lowered and the crowd has gone home. The hero is still standing. The crown is still there. The name still carries weight. And yet something has changed. Because the hardest part was never reaching the summit. It was learning how to live when the summit no longer moved. At first, that stillness feels like triumph. Then it begins to feel like a room with no doors. As if the world has stopped asking whether you could rise and started demanding that you remain exactly where it placed you. At this stage, the artist becomes something stranger than a person. Not just a performer, not even a voice, but a reference point. A fixed image held against time. A version of themselves that others can still reach for, even if that version no longer exists within them. This is where myth becomes uncomfortable, because myths understand this transformation better than we do. The king is not remembered for the moment he became king. He is remembered for what it cost to remain one. The warrior is not remembered for winning battles. He is remembered for what the battles turned him into. And in hip-hop, this pattern becomes visible not as metaphor, but as structure. Eminem becomes a comparison rather than a voice. Lil Wayne becomes a definition rather than a person. And what we call legacy is often just a moment a living human becomes a fixed idea in someone else's mind. But artists were never designed to stay the same. They were designed to move, to change, to begin again. So when movement is replaced with expectation, something inside begins to resist. Some artists reinvent themselves into new creations. Some disappear entirely. Some fracture between who they are and who they are expected to remain. Because expectation is not passive. It is active memory. It remembers a version of you that no longer exists and demands its continuation. And slowly, the realization hits. You are no longer making art freely. You are creating under preservation. And preservation is not life. It is maintenance. At this point, greatness stops being about achievement. It's now about endurance. And the tragedy is not that artists change. It is that change is interpreted as loss, when in reality, it is simply the cost of continuing to exist beyond the moment you were first crowned. There are only so many ways a person can endure permanence. When you are no longer permitted to evolve, when you can no longer shift naturally between versions of yourself, and even silence begins to be interpreted as meaning, something eventually has to break. Not always loudly, not always visibly, but always inevitably. Because permanence does not ask who you are becoming. It asks who you are allowed to remain. And there are only a few answers to that question. Some people respond by refusing stillness entirely. They do not stay in one form long enough to be preserved. They rebuild themselves repeatedly, as if identity itself must remain in motion to survive observation. In older mythology, this resembles fire that never settles into ash, a force that reshapes itself before it can be captured. A figure like Prometheus does not survive by escaping consequence, but by transforming consequence into continuation. This is reinvention, not evolution, not growth, but refusal to be fixed. A life built on the constant rewriting of its own definition. Others choose something quieter, not movement, but absence. They step outside the frame entirely, not as disappearance from failure, but disappearance from interpretation. In ancient stories, this resembles the oracle who speaks once and then withdraws from being seen again. Because visibility itself becomes distortion. Some figures survive by becoming unreachable, not lost, not gone, but removed from the pressure of being understood in real time. This is disappearance, not escape from greatness, but escape from being reduced to it. And then there are those who do something stranger. They do not leave. They do not reinvent endlessly. They do not disappear. They expand. They stop being contained within the identity of artists altogether. They become systems, structures, entire environments that continue functioning even when the original moment that created them has passed. Like ancient builders whose names fade, but whose cities remain. They are no longer measured by output, but by what continues to exist because they existed. This is transformation, not survival of identity, but survival beyond identity. But underneath all of these responses, reinvention, disappearance, transformation, is the same realization that permanence was never the reward. It was the test, and the test was never about how high you could climb. It was about what you would do when climbing was no longer possible. Because at that point, you are no longer dealing with ambition. You are dealing with endurance under observation. And every myth eventually bends around that truth. Not the rise, not the victory, but what remains when movement is no longer allowed. There is something no one tells you about winning. Not because it is hidden, but because it only becomes visible once you're there. At first, it feels like silence. Then it feels like weight. Then slowly, it begins to feel like recurrence. Because once every road has taken you somewhere, you begin to notice something unsettling. There is nowhere else for the world to send you. Only variations of where you already are. And maybe that is what permanence truly is. Not a place, not a state, but the removal of unfamiliarity. In mythology, this is where the story stops behaving like a journey and starts behaving like reflection. The hero is no longer moving through the world. The world is now passing through with the memory of who they used to be. And so the question changes one final time. Not, how do I succeed? Not, what do I turn into? But, what remains when transformation is no longer available? Because at that point, even greatness stops feeling like success. It stops feeling like victory. It stops feeling like completion. It starts feeling like something quieter. a life continuing without the promise of change. This is where hip-hop becomes less about music and more about testimony. Because every artist who reaches the top eventually meets the same strange realization that the crown does not end the story, it preserves it. Hov does not merely evolve, he becomes a standard by which evolution is measured. Slim Shady does not merely continue, he becomes the benchmark for longevity. Weezy does not merely influence, he becomes the scale by which influence is understood. And what we call legacy is often just a life no longer allowed to be unknown. But the human mind was never built for permanence. It was built for change, for oblivion, for beginning again. So when change is no longer private, when every moment is observed, every silence is interpreted, something inside begins to resist. It's not always loud, not always visible, but ultimately, that resistance takes only a few forms: reinvention, disappearance, or transformation into something larger than the original identity itself. Because no one survives permanence by remaining the same, and no one survives greatness by staying who they were when they first earned it. The tragedy was never that people reached the top. The tragedy is that we expect them to stay there as if the climb never changed them, as though change was meant to end the moment the world began to look. But the finish line was never where the story ended. It was where an entire new story just began. Subscribe if you liked the video. Comment any ideas you have for a video. Thank you for watching. Southside out.